in Australia. And just to give you a little bit of an introduction, in Career Combating Climate Change, we are speaking with key individuals in climate change and green energy industry, and just learning a little bit more about their career. As an individual, what sort of choices and decisions made you to be where you are right now, and what kind of challenges you might have faced so far? So just to kick off, maybe you can talk us through your career today.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, thank you so much to you and the wider Boss team for giving me the opportunity to share a bit more about my career today. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first podcast interview, so where I'm actually the interviewee. So it's nice to shift the gear a bit. I'm usually on the platform interviewing people in the broader climate space. So it's a great opportunity for me to kind of share my thoughts on the industry. Personally, I think my own personal climate journey really started about a decade ago when I was in grad school in New York. I was studying at Columbia, and I became really interested in getting a better understanding of sustainable development, but also access to clean energy. And for me, it really started as having grown up in Thailand, getting a better understanding of how the role of clean energy in improving access to energy within the broader Asia Pacific region, but also getting an understanding of really the power of technology, clean technology, to displace fossil fuels in these markets. So after I completed my master's in New York, I went back to the region, to the Asia Pacific region, and worked in Thailand first, and spent some time in Singapore, a broader part of my career in Singapore, working at Siemens Financial Services, working on power projects in the broader Asia Pacific region. I think how I approached the problem was really I wanted to get a better understanding of what are the different elements that are involved in really getting a infrastructure project, particularly in the power generation space, up and running. And I thought that was a great training ground for me to understand, both from a technical perspective, but also the financing and regulatory challenges of the energy transition.
Oh, amazing. And you might already touch upon that, but what was the reason? What made you really decide to work in the sector, and what was the main drive for you to become part of the industry?
Yeah, the main driver for me, I think, to begin, was I saw this when I was in grad school. I think there was a lot of investments going into clean energy, and at the time, and clean energy was really becoming this force that was taking off in a few markets, particularly with the EU. And I think I was trying to get an understanding of, well, how could you bring and transfer this technology to other parts of the world, particularly in emerging markets? And I think for me personally, it was always about the role that clean energy could play in the energy transition. But in the past decade, in the past couple of years, I think my focus has really shifted into getting an understanding of how I intertwine that climate peace into the broader energy transition. Because at the end of the day, I think I realize it's really about what we want to protect. And having grown up in Thailand and being close to nature, I think there was always this attachment that I had towards kind of looking at how do we protect the natural capital and biodiversity. And for me personally, that's motivation in working in the energy sector, is that it's about how do we solve the problem. And when we have a very tight timeline, that we know that as a world, as a global force, I think we need to move towards net zero, and decarbonization is key to that. And I think I've always been of the view that technologies can play a big role in helping us get there. And even today, I think I was reading in the International Energy Agency report that we have most of the technologies that are required to get to decarbonization, to keep 1.5 degree alive, as in line with Paris agreements. I think the policies and the financing is the current challenge that we're facing in many markets. And for me, I think being in the energy sector, you really get to be in the midst of all of that exciting action that is happening, and also the transition. I think I had many of my friends were working in the traditional sector, but I had stuck to kind of the energy sector for the broad decade, even though at times I question whether I really made the right decision, because it felt so hard. So much of energy is reliant on enabling environment and the policy environment within the market that you're working in. And I think for the first time, we're really seeing a lot of global momentum, particularly in the developed markets across the US, EU, and here where I am in Australia as well, clear policies from the government to drive the sector forward, which is a really exciting time. And I think we've been waiting for a long time as an industry for this moment to happen.
You having such a strong vision and drive in the entire and so close with the nature. To understand, and you can hear the passion and drive, and it's all about the protection. And I like how you mentioned the tight timeline that, to be frank, is just getting tighter and tighter. So my next question was really about the challenges that you faced in the industry. You did mention about policy and finances so far, but overall, you're being very, very positive about the changes and the growth and sort of the direction that we're going. So apart from the policy and the finances, is there anything in specific that you did find challenging so far?
I think from an energy transition perspective, I think is the regulation and the permitting environment for some of the technologies that we're looking to deploy. I think cost of technology is still prohibitive in some of the markets that in many of the markets, that particularly in emerging markets. So it's really getting an understanding of how do we scale these technologies and bring the cost down. I think there are clear incentives that are being launched. If you look at the IRA in the US, I think across some of the incentive program are bringing down the cost of deploying like electric vehicle, residential battery storage, heat pumps by almost 40%, which is, I think, a great driver for enabling demand and consumer adoption of clean technologies. And that's a really exciting moment. But now we have to get a sense of, well, how do we scale these technologies in other markets as well where there are no subsidies? And I think it's got to be bringing it down the cost curve. And we always see that it's like with adopting any new technology, I think it follows an S curve. In the early stages, you have early adopters that kind of try this new technology, and then you reach a peak where obviously there's mass scale adoption. At least I try to think of, I'm a 90s kid. Well, 80s kid, but I think I just disclosed my age there. But obviously went through the transition from Nokia into iPhone, and I remember how fast I think Apple or iPhone and smartphone just took over.
I did as well, so.
Exactly. So, and I just remember how fast smartphones, particularly iPhone, took over kind of our lives, and particularly like everything that we did in the household. It's almost like my whole ecosystem of electronics, my laptop, became MacBook, and my parents started using Apple Watch. So I guess it's really, I'd like to think back and as in this period, and I'd like to see the same thing happen with clean tech. I'd like to think that the same type of proliferation of technology can happen really fast as we bring it down the cost curve. And we're already sitting here in Australia. I remember in 2021, I was working with two engineers to try to build a startup in the electric vehicle space. We spent 1 year trying to make that happen. Unfortunately, we couldn't find product market fit, but that was a great learning experience nonetheless. But when we went to investors and customers to sell them this vision and this idea of solving a problem in the electric vehicle space, there wasn't really enough EVs on the road. And now, about 24 months later, EVs are 8% of new car sales in Australia. So that transition is happening much quicker than I think we can predict, and even analysts or the figures can predict. So that's really exciting.
Yeah. And another question of mine. Yes. What would you say are your biggest achievements today in relation to fighting climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think over probably the decade that I've spent in the broader climate and energy space, I would have to say that there's been a lot of little wins along the way that I've really cherished. But I think the biggest one and the biggest learning exercise for me was when I went through the startup accelerator to try to build a software in the vehicle to grid space, as I was referring to earlier. For me, that was particularly a great learning exercise and achievement on a personal level because and I think prior to that, I hadn't really thought about building my own company per se, but I think this was in 2021, and prior to that, I think most of my career have been really focused on how to solve problems and decarbonize supply side, which is the electricity side of the equation. But then when 2021 happened and COVID happened, I think I, like many people who went through kind of a repivot in life and your purpose, thinking about your purpose, I started to focus on, well, renewable energy and a lot of technologies like wind and solar are quite mature already, but there are a lot of problems on the demand side and electrification of end users that haven't been resolved yet at the consumer level. So how do we really shift the focus on the demand side, whether you look at transportation, residential, household, in decarbonizing industries? There's so many opportunities to focus on. And for me, that 1 year of trying to build a startup was really trying to understand, well, what are the challenges that the residential sector and consumers are facing when trying to transition when trying to be part of the energy transition, and really to try to build a vision or build a product that is going to bring value to consumers, help them be part of the energy transition, but also on a personal level, getting an understanding of how, when you're really in the early stages of trying to build a startup, I think it's really, you don't have the type of resources that you do when you're employed at a large corporate and you have the institutional branding. I think you have to learn to be really resourceful, and that's one of the things that I learned, is to understand how to really listen to the customer really well, understand their problem. And so much of my day-to-day currently in my role, in my current role at Iberdrola, where I'm really focus on solving problems in the C&I sector, which is the commercial and industrial sector, which is a bit different to what I was doing while I was trying to build my own startup. But I think the biggest takeaway I got was really to learn how to listen to customers, to understand what are the challenges they're facing in meeting their sustainability goals, and also the implementation challenges. And you really start to learn where the opportunities are, the challenges of the decarbonization, but also the opportunities where you can really add value for customers.
You mentioned that very visible difference here between working for a very large corporation, which you're a part of right now, of course, and then being a woman and trying to wear all the hats within the business, working on your startup with so many ideas, so many plans, but also so many challenges to be faced. So, I mean, definitely very admirable, because I know that this takes a lot of courage. There is challenges that you will face that you're expecting, and 10 times more than nobody has ever expected, for sure. So currently, looking back, if you could give piece of advice to anyone who wants to start a career within the renewable space and fighting climate change, or asking you specifically, someone who wants to start their own business within clean tech, what would that advice be?
I think the biggest advice that I would give anyone trying to break into the clean tech and clean energy sector, who haven't had experience into this sector before. And I recall in my own personal experience 10 years ago of trying to find a job in clean energy and how challenging it was, because it wasn't as big of a market as it is, and it was quite niche and specialized at the time. Renewable energy, I mean, it still is to a large degree, but because there's so much demand for clean energy, I think the IEA talks about a need to triple renewable energy capacity to 2030. That's going to create a lot of demand for new jobs and new skill set that needs to be created. So I think the biggest advice I would have is to not be afraid to learn and not be afraid to fail. I think when I started off, I think I was really afraid to make mistakes, and particularly when you're younger and you're just starting out your career, you want to make sure that you're taking the right steps, you're making the right steps on your career journey, and you're finding the right big name institutions and the right opportunities. But I really, in hindsight, I think I would say that I never made all the right steps along the way, but all of them were great learning journeys. And I would say that, yeah, having that attitude and that approach towards not being afraid to make mistakes and fail is really important. And that's something that I also learned. Well, was one of the biggest lessons that I learned from being in the startup ecosystem is that I think giving yourself that opportunity to try a few things. If it doesn't work out, pivot, but knowing that at the end of the day, you're still committed to your goal, your mission of decarbonization or climate action. And I think you will get there eventually, but it is kind of a long-term game. And you have to take a view that we're talking about 2050 here in some approaches, with 2030 being a very important interim target, right? So if you take a view that this is really a marathon, I think that's going to take the pressure of having to find the right opportunity from the beginning, and just being focused on learning.
The idea of comparing it to a marathon, not a race. And you brought up something very important about just failing forward, because I don't want to lie right now. I'm not sure what the number is. I think it's about 70% of startups globally that fail. The only reason to fail, really, the only way to fail is not to try. So these things are going to happen. They are going to make you very, very resilient. And this is the only way to really be cool and make things happen within the industry. So I really like the positive mindset that you can hear through every sentence, really. Well, Pavina, thank you so much for taking your time. We're literally on two other ends of the world. Good morning to me, and I think it's soon going to be a good night to you. It was a pleasure having you on. Very, very insightful conversation, and I hope that we will speak in the future, and our paths will definitely cross sometime soon.
Thank you so much, Marika. I've really enjoyed this interview, and looking forward to see the final product. And yeah, hope you have an amazing morning and